Hello, everyone. We're going to give it another few seconds as people filter into the room. So we'll get started momentarily. All right, and with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Monitoring Flood Threats. My name is Mike Nichols, and I'm the I'm the manager of content and social media here at AEM. And on behalf of our entire team, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited about today's session, but before we get started, we do need to cover a little bit of housekeeping. So we'll get that out of the way right now. First of all, the webinar is being recorded. That recording, along with the slide deck, that'll be available to you after the webinar. You'll want to watch for that to come your way via email later on. Also, all attendees are being muted during the presentation, but we want you to ask your questions as they come to you throughout the presentation. To do that, just use that questions button you see on the screen and type them into the questions box. We'll review and respond during our audience Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And then when we wrap up the Q&A, if you still have any remaining questions or if you'd like to learn more about AEM solutions, please feel free to contact us. That email address is info@aem.eco, and we'll also provide that again at the end of today's presentation. And so with that, today's webinar is being brought to you by AEM. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take just a quick moment to tell you a little bit about what AEM does. The first thing you should know is that AEM is a purpose-driven organization that exists to give communities and organizations what they need to survive, even thrive in the face of escalating environmental risks like floods, wildfires, storms, winter weather, and any other number of other extreme weather events. To deliver on that promise, we've developed a truly integrated end-to-end multi-hazard platform. That platform is built around some of the leading expertise in the industry for early warning system design. It's also supported by some of the most reliable sensing networks that integrate with any number of other sources to deliver high quality data and actionable insights through applications like AEM Elements 360. And at the end of the day, it all comes together when moments matter to help our clients make the right decisions exactly when those decisions need to be made. And as a result, our clients are more resilient and better positioned to drive positive outcomes in the face of environmental hazards. So with that out of the way, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. And our first up, we've got James Logan. And there's James. Hi, James. James leads our AEM water sector. He's been involved in the assessment, design, development, and implementation of more than 200 automated flood, early warning, and environmental monitoring systems across the US and abroad. He's also led numerous consulting studies related to rainfall and hydrologic analysis, flooding, stormwater, dam safety, hydrology, and water resource management. James is also a member and contributor to the U.S. National Hydrologic Warning Council's Technical Working Group for the Alert 2 Protocol Standard. And then next up, we've got Ryan Guerrero. There's Ryan. Hi, Ryan. And Ryan is AEM's product manager for hardware. Ryan has more than a decade of experience in hardware testing, field work, and business development in the environmental environmental monitoring market, with special emphasis on hydrologic monitoring. So with that, we're just about ready to dive into today's presentation. James is going to be starting us off by reviewing AEM's framework for multi-hazard warning systems, showing us where monitoring flood risks fits into the overall framework. Then we'll bring on Ryan. He'll discuss the 3 phases for creating a flood monitoring network: the design, discovery, implementation, not in that order that I just said. Lastly, we'll open it up for the audience Q&A. And as a reminder, please feel free to keep asking those questions throughout today's presentation. As they come to you, the Q&A is when they'll get answered. So just about ready to turn over to our speakers. But before I do that, they've asked that we pose a quick question to you to help them tailor the presentation to your needs. So with that, let's go ahead and bring up our first poll question. Where is your organization in the development process for flood early warning systems? Go ahead and let those answers come in. Are you just starting to investigate and research? Maybe you're actively planning and budgeting. Maybe you're currently implementing, or you even already have a system in place. Let us know. All right, so those votes are coming in. We'll let a few more trickle in here. So it looks like the vast majority, well, a majority, we've got 50% are just starting to investigate and research. We've got 35% already have a system in place, and we've got even a handful who are actively planning and budgeting. So I'd say today's presentation is going to have something for everyone. This is a high-level, quick and dirty overview of what's involved in monitoring hydrologic hazards like flooding. So I think even if you're just starting out, you're going to get a lot of value out of this. If you're planning and budgeting, you're going to get some pretty technical ideas as well. And even if you already have a system in place, I'm sure that James, Ryan are going to have some good insights to maybe make you think twice about opportunities maybe where you might expand, do things a little differently. So I feel confident this is going to be a great session for all of you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring on James, who will take it from here. James?
Yeah, hello everybody. So what I want to do is I just want to recap because where this fits into a series that we're creating on flood warning systems. And so go ahead to the next slide. So we've got a framework that we're that was actually developed by the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Group. That it's a framework that we've sort of adopted for early warning systems. And the reason we've adopted it is that it's really useful in thinking about how to build an early warning system and doing things with a consistent approach to doing it. Because what my experience, and I've worked with a lot of agencies all over the US in flood warning systems, is that the approach to it is almost completely different for almost every agency I've worked with. There's not a consistent approach that they've been using in the US. And so we're trying to apply this approach to make things more consistent and also give a structure to the way these things are done. So just to recap the framework that we were talking about, we have there's a risk knowledge component, which is understanding what are the risks to the particular hazard you're dealing with, and this hazard is flood hazard. And then there's a monitoring and forecasting component, which is essentially watching for when the events and planning and forecasting when those events are going to happen. And then handling communications to agencies or the public, depending on the role your system has in your area. And then the response, which is really the execution of the emergency action plans, and whether you have people do evacuations, whether you block roads, what are the things that you do in response to the events that happen. And then the last step is something that we believe is a continuous improvement approach to things, which is you look at what happened after every single event, you evaluate what worked and what didn't work, and you make changes to improve your system. So let's go ahead onto the next slide. And this is just a sort of a description of that same process, but it's a sort of a circular process. Going to the next if you would please. So, so this particular approach, it applies to any type of hazard. So that's an important piece here, because this approach it makes it a consistent approach for everything, and it can be applied to flooding, rock slides and landslides, to wildfire hazards, extreme weather, earthquakes, tsunamis, drought, even man-made hazards like maybe there's a train, rail cars derail, and it causes a environmental hazard because of the spilled oil and diesel and stuff like that. But all these things sort of can follow a similar approach to how they're managed and how they're planned for. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is sort of a graphic depicting the framework. So you sort of need to follow the numbers here, but in the case of flooding, we're essentially initially doing analysis of where are the flood risks, and that's based on information derived from lots of sources, information on past flooding, flood maps, other sources where you have schools and hospitals and where the public might be, where they could be intersecting with potential flood risks. So all that information is part of what you gather. And then step 2, which we're here to talk about today, is the monitoring and forecasting. And the monitoring, we're going to focus on monitoring. There's actually going to be a separate webinar that the next one will be on forecasting and approaches to forecasting. But this one's going to be about the monitoring piece. And then that information from 1 and 2 feed into a decision support system, which then is what you use to initiate communications to the public or communications to public emergency agencies. And then the response is really how is the public supposed to respond, and are they trained and educated on what to do when these events occur. And that's something. All these other steps we'll cover later on in the series. And then as I said, after every single event, you want to do an evaluation and improvement so that the next time that something happens, whatever didn't go right the last time has been fixed, and then you do a better job the next time around. So let's go on to the next slide piece. So as I mentioned, we'll focus on number 2, and only the monitoring aspect of that is what this particular webinar is on. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan. Ryan, you're muted.
Well, thank you, James. And let's dig in here. I'm happy to be a part of this and excited to share some of the knowledge I've gained throughout the years and also across our AEM platform. There's a lot of experience there that I think we can leverage. So diving into this thing, we're going to go through discovering all the potential sites that's in that discovery. We design for the right network where we start eliminating different sites we think are less attractive to our cause. And then at the end, we're going to start implementing that design and kind of walk through those steps. So let's start with the discovery. And discovery, first off, we got to identify the system purpose. So the system purpose is, if we have flood warning, is that more like nuisance flooding information? Is that, protection of life? What are we looking at achieving here? Are we going to use this for engineering? Is there some way to better our drainage or watershed system? Are we going to use it for both? And understanding what the purpose is, then we start noticing who cares about this information. Well, we start bringing in partners and contributors, and are they going to have unique sensor requirements? So all the sensor requirements, you could have different specs, you could have different sensor types, or even different measurement types. If you're trying to share with a weather agency and utilize the backbone of the information that's being sent, if you're in a hurricane-ridden area, you're going to want wind versus somewhere that we're really just monitoring nuisance flooding. Wind and weather data probably isn't something we're considering. On the all sensors require maintenance. So let's get that out. So, but some sensors require much more maintenance than others. So we've got to take in consideration, who's benefiting from this, and if we bring on a sensor, what does that entirely hold for us as a community or as a team, right? And then, is there any existing sites we could scrub data from? Who are we working with? So that's something to consider. Over the years, kind of helping people establish networks, one of the things we've discovered is we like to actually add additional grading criteria. So some of these grading criteria is pretty standard, like, hey, what are the weather patterns in the area? So when are we monitoring more often? Yada, yada, yada. What's historical data look like? What does watersheds and drainage look like? So we know where to, consider our efforts. Two of the ones that I think are overlooked more often than not are local tribal knowledge. Someone that really knows, hey, when we flood over here, whatever the models say, whatever we flood over here, we end up flooding in these 5 areas. We can have a better chance at monitoring over here. And then also the relationship between precipitation and stream level. We tend to just think, we need to monitor the stream level. But if we can get that precipitation relationship figured out, we start to get a much bigger idea of what's coming at us and have a better warning for us and be able to give us more time to make the decisions we need to make. So definitely things to consider, and to provide your own tweak towards what's important to you, and start to rate those potential locations. All right, we've established the grading criteria. So now we're going to go into identifying any potential site that we could possibly think would be beneficial for us. Now, this is kind of a brainstorming activity, so it's like no bad ideas, no idea is a bad idea. It's no location is a bad location until we start to filter out. And I just want to, urge everybody to put more stations in mind than less stations to begin with. We can always whittle down, but it's always hard once you get to the end point to start adding in stations. All right, how do we start rating these? We have the rating curve, the rating points that we had ahead of time, but we also have a rate risk and potential for the potential monitoring stations. And this is just strictly based on coverage. So all the way down to the bottom, if you're very redundant, you have 2 sites that are basically hitting the same points for water location, one of those can be removed. We don't need both. And how we determine which one's removed, we're going to get into more things on how we can determine that, along with that grading criteria we just hit above, versus your excellence, which is, we're going to cover upstream, we're going to cover 90% of the watershed. So nothing's really redundant here in this path. We can heavily rely on this location, and it's a good location for us to use. All right, now we want to identify some of these locations as surveying locations. When we go out to survey, and we're going to start, we're still in this discovery mode, trying to figure out what locations we want. We're going to start to go out and survey, so then we can come back and design and start getting rid of all the stations we don't want to have. In our survey, there's some things that are very important, and some things that are, less important. How I've heard people talk about, well, how big of an eyesore is this? It's really not something we want to consider, but things that often get overlooked that are really important is how accessible is the sensor and the station when we need to go out and do maintenance, and the installation itself. Who owns the bridge, the land that we want to put this on? Do we need special rights to be able to install? Is there added security to it? Is there power available? And one of the biggest things, if you're going like radios, is there some type of line of sight to your base station or cell tower, or what kind of connectivity do you actually have at that location? So very important to consider all 5 of these points when looking at your surveys. We're going to use these as basically those tiebreakers when we have sites that are pretty close side by side. All right, so designing is where it kind of gets, I think we've done all the legwork, and it gets kind of fun to start diving into this a little more. Now, with our design, we're going to first focus on our software, because we've got to figure out, first off, what we need out of this. Is this really real-time collection? Most flood warning people, they need it as real-time as possible. You know, if you're just using this for water inventory purposes, trying to understand where water is going and have a general idea, maybe not as crucial for you. But you also need to, again, know who wants that data. If you're collecting it for flood warning, but somebody, or collecting it for quantity purposes, but somebody else is using it for flood warning, we're probably going to need a pretty real-time collection platform. Now, QA/QC, you know, most of you know, it's super important. We don't want to be, you know, propagating bad data throughout our decision-making process. Visualization. Often people want to, you know, say, oh, we're just gonna see it on a monitor at the EOC. Well, that's great, but did you want a public-facing visualization platform there? Did you want ability for your techs to be able to get to see the visualization on their cell phones, or do they need to come into the office? On that note, tools and reporting. There's some pretty great tools out there. Do you have the ability to network map, to actually know where the connection points are going through your network? Do you have inventory management? There's going to be a level of inventory for spares and even those that are deployed in the field. And then also the maintenance cycle. You know, you want to be able to tag something and have it alarm and alert you when maintenance is needed, or when this cycle has come up and you need to be, you know, preparing for that. Alerting types. Alerting types is usually something everybody has a grandiose idea about, and then they start to realize the pros and cons of alerting. You know, do you really want to send mass hysteria to the rest of the public? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. At what level do you send those messages? And who gets to perform the QA/QC on those messages? Are we alerting our techs when critical levels have been hit, and alerting people to get to the EOC to make the decisions we need to make? And then I've kind of talked a little bit about, you know, do you have to go to the office? Can you get things on your cell phone? How available do you want this data to be, and to who you want it available to? Telemetry is the kind of the big scary thing most people talk about, and try to put this into a chart where you can quickly go through and make some decisions based off of the feedback you're getting from this site survey, and also performing site surveys on the reliability. But real time is one of those things that is always going to be considered there. You know, you have things like alert to SCADA radios that, you know, they're going to be within minutes. And it's fairly real time when it comes to decision making in most parts. You have cellular that is very real time, but could have some reliability issues in certain areas, and even some coverage issues depending on how rural you are. Go satellite can work very well if you have a longer duration of time between transmissions, and, you know, it's not as real time as needed. It does have the 2-minute random transmission, but that sometimes isn't as reliable. And so if you're doing flood warning, you're doing it for life protection, probably need to be doing more of the alert to SCADA type systems, or even to the right, the satellite modem, be it via Iridium or Inmarsat. Now, those two can become very costly, not only upfront, but the data charges themselves can be pretty high. So keep that in mind. Other things to keep in mind: do you have a current infrastructure? Are you going to be required to put in infrastructure? Do you have the means to do that? Is it two-way? Is it only one way? Do you need two-way? And obviously, one of the big things is rural or urban. What distance from station to receiver or cell tower? What do you have available for you to use? And some of these are pretty power hungry, depending on what you're using. And so you will need to maybe have, you know, line power there available if you're using something like a high power SCADA data radio. So keep that in mind. And this is just there as a tool to use to kind of keep things top of mind. Now, we're going to take all these parts and pieces, and when we've got those, we've really got a good base to our monitoring locations. What we don't have yet is sensors. And we're going to run through this, I mean, really, really quickly, because we have some other tools that we'll point to here in a minute. But one thing I wanted to touch on specifically was rain gauge locations. I think a lot of the time I've seen people rush into, well, we're just going to put a rain gauge on every station, and that's all we're going to put. And sometimes usually it's not the best attack when it comes to putting your rain gauges out there. So a couple of main takeaways for rain gauges: they need to be installed away from any potential debris falling into the rain gauge. There's going to be debris falling in, but the less you can do, the less maintenance you'll be required and the better data you'll get. Another thing is install away from any high wind shear. If your wind is falling sideways because of the amount of wind it's getting, there's nothing going into that rain gauge unless you have the space for wind shields and the likes, and that's typically not the case. So keep that in mind. Utilize your bird spikes. Roosting nests, I want to say that if you don't utilize a bird spike, it will become a bird bath, and that's just kind of the way it goes. So utilize those bird spikes, and then I've also seen when your stations that you put out, and one of the reasons I discourage just putting rain gauges on existing locations, they're more towards waterways, and begin to be clumped up around the waterway and watershed. Rain is distributed evenly as it starts pouring into your area. And so we need to capture that accordingly and distribute them across the watershed if possible. And so we will have precip only locations if we want the best monitoring we can get. Now, special consideration for just really quick for water level measurements. I say the biggest thing I always ask first is, if you've identified an area, is there a structure available? And the being is, we have some maintenance that needs to be done on all these sensors. And between the two main water level sensor measurements, radars and pressure transducers, radars are highly, they have by far the less maintenance between the two. However, if you don't have a structure, they become very hard to implement. So having a structure in place typically lends to, hey, let's look at a radar sensor. When it comes to both, we want to protect it from debris. Radars are a little easier to do that because you typically don't have water level going over the bridge or the structure that you're mounted to, but still something to consider. You want to avoid turbulence at all possible with PTs or radars. We usually talk about turbulence in terms of PTs, but if we're measuring right on a very turbulent area, we're going to get some big adjustments, dips maybe in the water level that we will get false readings from at high flow. So one thing, and then another thing to consider is know exactly the maintenance requirements for both of the sensor or all of the sensor types that you're looking to do, not just water level, but there's a big maintenance difference between the two. And if you have the bandwidth for the PT and you can put better locations because you have less bridges and structures, then great. But really understand that you're going to have to go replace desiccant. You're going to have to pull the PTs out and clean them off sometimes for fouling. And there's different levels of maintenance required for every sensor that you have out there. Okay, here's the resources I talked about earlier. These resources are out there to help you select different sensors for the different applications you're using. So we have discharge measurements, we have level measurements, and then we also have some weather station sensor selections. So these are typically the ones used in hydro situations. And so if there's more needed, just let us know and we can help guide you to the different sensor decision making that you're trying to achieve. But these should pretty much nail what you're trying to do. And there's some links there when you get the slides. All right, so now we got to move on to actually making this thing work. We're going to implement our solution. One of the biggest oversights I've seen in the implementation is physical space. So we've just decided we want a vast number of stations, and then those stations comes with structures and sensors and cross arms and all of these devices and structures that take up a large room. How is that equipment going to arrive to us? Are we going to be able to put this in a warehouse? Do we have space for that? What are the dimensions we need to house everything? Is it coming in shifts? Are we going to do this in phases because we can't afford to get everything at once? Or are we taking everything on at the same time? Outside of once we've implemented it, we need to typically maintain a level of spares. Now, we can always rely on spares to be shipped to us, but typically when we need a spare, it's identified that we need something really soon. And we don't want to rely on somebody's ability to ship due to maybe a different order that came in that was pretty big. So we want some spares. So that's physical space. On the personnel side, do we have the expertise to do this installation? Do we have the manpower to do this installation? Who will perform the annual maintenance and the maintenance of, all the failures that happen? Because electronics fail. I mean, they do fail, and nobody's exempt from that. So we need to perform this maintenance to make sure our stuff is top notch. Do we have, so that's personnel wise. We're going to have to go out, site these things. Do we have the expertise? Who's going to do this? Where will it be? And then back to the software. Who's going to set up the initial ingestion of the data, all the sensor data, making the alert parameters get set up? Who's going to set up the links and the pulls and pushes to share the data with the different stakeholders? And then setting up those inventory, asset management, tracking that we talked about earlier. We need to make sure that we have all of these steps figured out before we actually implement our solution. And with that, that's kind of us going through the actual design phase and discovery, design, and implementation of the framework. So I'm going to send this back over to James, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. That was a great presentation. Could you go to the next slide, please? So just to recap, because I want to still give everybody the context of this presentation, that it's all part of a process that we're trying to share with everybody on how to go about doing risk reduction through putting in an early warning system. And so we have this process that we talked about, these sort of 5 steps that we've put together for a framework for putting together an early warning system. I'm going to the next one again, I think. And our focus today is on step 2, the monitoring. But as I said, we've already covered the risk knowledge piece in a previous webinar. We're covering the monitoring, and we've covered the overall framework, but we're going to build out other webinars that are going to cover the rest of this framework so that people can understand and have some tools to help them when they're implementing or designing and implementing and planning for their early warning systems that they have. Ryan's presentation is covering these 3 major steps: the discovery, which is really learning your requirements; the design, which is then designing to meet those requirements; and then the implementation, which is the deployment of the system and getting the early warning system up and running. So going to the next.
All right. Well, James, thank you. And also Ryan, thank you. That was some great information you guys shared. It looks like it also sparked some great questions for our audience, which we're about to get to. But before we open it up to the questions from the audience, I would like to pose one final question to all of you. And based on today's presentation, how well prepared are you to monitor flood threats? Where you stand today, how well prepared do you feel? All right, we've got answers still coming in. We'll give that a little bit more. All right, so looks like about a quarter of our respondents feel very prepared, and that's great for you. If you really are, that's wonderful. I'd say even if even the best flood monitoring networks have or flood early warning systems, there's usually room for improvement. I mean, that is part of being prepared, is the continuous feedback and continuous improvement. So always be on the lookout for where you can do better. Somewhat prepared, that's great. I mean, okay, and then we've got a handful, about a quarter, say that they don't feel as prepared as they would like. So hopefully, those of you who feel somewhat prepared, not prepared, hopefully all of you picked up some insights today that'll help you maybe go ahead and make those changes to your systems, implement some changes. And we do have, obviously, our team is available to assist with that, any changes that you might be thinking about. That said, I think it's time for us to go ahead and dive into our audience Q&A. So we'll go ahead and bring James and Ryan back so we can go ahead and dive into some of your questions. Great. And we have a couple of great questions right off the bat, came in early. James, you had mentioned that the framework, it was developed by the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. So does that mean that the framework is really just for like international early warning systems?
No, so the approach for this framework is this framework works for national systems. It works for city, state, local, county, regional systems. The same, because you use the same approach in all cases. It's scalable, from the smallest early warning system up to the largest, and it's also useful not just in undeveloped countries but in fully developed countries, and so it's really it's becoming a worldwide standard for an approach to early warning systems. So it's really it's a useful framework for all of us to adopt and understand.
Great, thank you. And also, we had someone asked, so for designing and building a flood monitoring network, who actually does this? Is it on the client side? Are they expected to do it? Or does AM provide help? Or how do you get all of this done? Right?
Yeah, Mike, I can answer that. So great question, actually, and one we get quite often. So a project of this scale, it's typically very overwhelming for the people, even especially with those without the right expertise, right? So design and implementation of early warning systems, that's some of AEM's unique capabilities. So we've assisted hundreds of agencies in early warning with their system designs, redesigns, expansions. So I'm comfortable that we have expertise on staff that we can assist all phases of their design or building of their flood warning networks. But it's definitely something that can do, but can be very overwhelming if you don't know or don't feel comfortable doing it.
Great, thank you. James, did you have any color you'd like to add to that, or any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I agree with Ryan. It's something that it's something that AM can help with, and we have a lot of expertise in doing it. There are also many consultants and engineering firms also do this stuff, and we work side by side with them in helping with the design and implementation of these things too. So it's something that we work directly for clients helping to do it, and we've worked with in partnership with their local engineering firms that maybe are supporting them, and then so we can do it a lot of different ways. But that's something that we definitely support.
Great. This particular listener is located in the New England region, so the question is specifically for that, but I think it would apply more broadly. The question is whether there is access to flooding data, both historical and current, available, say, through the National Weather Service.
So I don't think that there's directly like a database somebody can just go to and get their flood data. Whatever we've done engagements and we help clients with these type of things, first of all, we go through and we work with the city, the government people that have actually dealt with the floods, and they identify the areas that they've had flooding in before. We've also had to pull pictures from news articles and photos that were taken to identify areas of flood problems. but it's typically the locals that know the most about where the flood problems were in the past, and so there's a whole process of engagement with local people to try to understand where their flood problems are and where they believe they have the biggest risk. And then we do that in combination. Then we start using other sources that are more, I'll just say, engineering or technical later on. But typically the local agencies have the most in-depth knowledge of where they've been impacted the most by flooding in the past.
All right. So actually, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, yeah. So just to add to that, I think that one of the main sources you could potentially seek after would be your local USGS office. They may have data from previous, but it would oftentimes would come at a cost, and so it is something you would have to look into. But I do want to echo James in that the local sources are typically the best sources, most accurate.
One other thing that we use to help us with a lot of the planning, and I didn't mention this before, but if there are any existing monitoring stations from like the USGS or other agencies, we try to use all that historical data to help support what we're trying to do. So we do have access to historical data on rainfall and river levels, but that's not quite the same as flood data. It's data that supports what we're trying to do, and it gives us information to support building the flood network, but it's not exactly the same as knowing where the flooding occurred and what businesses were flooded, what streets were flooded, things like that. It's typically measurements that are like in rivers that are where water's there all the time and stuff like that. So it's a different kind of thing. And in our world, we think of two different kinds of flooding. There's river flooding, which is typically fairly well measured, but then there's rainfall, extreme rainfall driven flooding, which is more like flash flooding, and that's not doesn't always happen in river channels. It can happen through neighborhoods and parks and things like that. So it happens in other places.
So our next question up, really creative one, I think. What are your thoughts on crowdsourcing weather stations to collect data from private property owners? I'll leave that open to both of you.
I'll just give my perspective on it. So it's my belief that there's people that are decision makers need to make decisions based on high quality data. So you want to have some stations that you completely 100% trust the data you're getting from them. But given that, as long as you know which stations are the trusted stations, you also, any other stations give you more information. So for example, if you have a bunch of public, homeowners weather stations that there's a network of, like AEM, for example, has access to all the Davis weather stations around the world, and there's like, I don't know what the number is. It's like 140,000 weather stations all over the world that could be used as additional information so that you can understand a better picture of what's going on in an area. But you still want to have the what I'll just call the high quality, well-maintained controlled stations that you trust 100%, and those are the ones that you sort of have to understand the difference between those and a home station, because home stations may not be cited as well as like all the stuff that Ryan talked about for how to properly site a station. Most people just put them in their backyards, and they may have trees nearby and other things that impact all the weather parameters, so it's not measuring correctly. So you have to understand the source of the data, but my belief is that you should use as much data as possible to understand the bigger picture. But when you're making decisions, you've got to sort of rely on your tried and true stations, because those are the ones that are well maintained, that the data coming from those are giving you quality data.
Any thoughts to add to that, Ryan?
Yeah, I guess my only thing there would be, the law of averages works to your benefit when you're crowdsourcing, and so I understand the need to feel comfortable with averaging out any inconsistencies. However, when there's too many inconsistencies, as James has pointed out, and we've seen that through certain data sets that we've looked through, right? You still need ground truth, and when you're ground truthing your data, it's got to be something you rely on. So I've always felt that you have your main stations, and then your crowdsourcing is more of infill data that you're checking everything on the outside of your tried and true stations. So that's kind of just echoing that.
So no, this is great. And then we've got a follow-up question from a different one of our audience members. I think it's on the same general topic. The question is, there are multiple online private weather station networks like Weather Underground or like Wonderground, Ambient, Tempest. Is there a single source to capture all this data for possibly for free? I think my follow-up to that question would be, and would you want to?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were just talking about. There's sources out there. I don't know of a one single source you could pull anyway. You'd have to be scrubbing the internet for random sources from everywhere. But I do believe that all weather data starts with sensors. So, whether or not you're pulling those sensors yourself or you're trying to scrub the internet from it, but at some point you have to have positive control over, what data you're getting fed. So, you need to know why something had an anomaly, and you're going to go out and investigate and find that, oh, this water has become pretty turbulent in this area. We need to move this PT to this location because it's too turbulent. If you can't trust that the person that's creating that data set on the other side is doing that type of maintenance and that type of scrutiny, some of these, and also what level of data accuracy you're looking for. If we're talking protection of life, I won't rely on somebody else's data. I need to have positive control on that. So those are just things to consider, but I don't know of one source where you can pull everything from.
So
Sure.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. So the typically the stuff that's out there is weather stations and weather stations only. So that's going to give you rainfall and wind speed, some other parameters. But flood warning systems also need water level sensors that are measuring stream and river levels and flow. And so that's not something you typically get from these. People don't install them on a personal basis or crowdsource those types of things. It's typically an agency that has some stake in the water that's flowing down there that is putting those type of stations in, and you need those stations too. So I think you sort of have to make sure that you take into the whole picture. You need water level sensors also to have an effective flood early warning system, and so that part needs to be thought about, and it's like I said, it's got to come from, typically it's some agency that has some stake in that water that's flowing through those areas that put those stations in, and and much of that data that's out there on the water level stuff, you have to understand also the timeliness of it, because some of it only gets transmitted once an hour, and if you're dealing with flash flooding, once an hour is not enough to use that data to support early warning for flash flooding. But for river levels where they don't change that quickly, then the once an hour stuff is okay. But those are all things that need to be taken into account when you're thinking about the data you need, and even trying to leverage existing data sources that are out there, because there are I mean, one of the tenets that we have when we designed our software platform was that it doesn't just use the data from your stations, but it allows us to ingest data from all these other sources, bring it into one place, and you get one view of many sources of data in one place, and that sort of makes all that data more valuable, because you can do the comparisons of your stations compared to your neighbor stations or the public stations or whatever. You get it all together, and you don't have to jump from web page to web page to try to figure out whether the data is consistent across different sources that you have. It all gets brought into one place.
I think that's a really excellent point, Jen. That's an excellent point. Continuing on this same theme, seems to be a pretty popular theme, but we do have a really nice insight here, less of a question. Someone pointed out that if you're looking for that baseline data that you can tap into, not necessarily replacing everything you would need to gather yourself, but that baseline data, a great place to start is some of your state and regional information, like what FIMAN captures in North Carolina, right? So that's a great point, I think. I don't know if you guys wanted to elaborate on that or add anything else to that, or
only that, you know, we're pretty familiar with the FIMAN solution there, and again, that's a great regional area that's doing a lot of good work. They're maintaining their stations. They're, you know, trying to do the best they can to put out the best data they can, and so it's a great starting point when you're trying to pull data. But even the people there, I'm sure would say that the more localized your data can be, especially with the Appalachian Mountains there, you get some pretty crazy weather patterns coming off there, dump a lot of water very quickly. The more localized you can get, the better you are in making your decisions. So that's,
and then,
but yeah, great source.
Yeah, and then James, I think you hit on a point earlier that I think it's worth maybe talking a little bit further about. You talked about even if you are pulling all this data, right? You've got this data coming from all these different sources. How are you going to make sense of it, right? So in your experience historically, how are people approaching that? I mean, so if they're pulling in like FIMAN data, right, and then they've got their own local rain gauges, and they've got their local water gauges, and then they've got National Weather Service alerts. How are they bringing all that together to look at it and historically?
So like I had said earlier, one of the things that we've tried to do is build a platform that people can bring all this data together in a single platform, so they're not having to jump from place to place to see it. So you can compare and even graph, your station compared to the next station on the same graph. Those types of things that make the data more useful. I think that's a sort of a positive way in dealing with it. And just one other thing, a point I'd like to make really about the FIMAN network compared to the rest of the country. The FIMAN network, that the state took really a strong responsibility to build a network that would support the state's needs, and not all states are doing what they're doing. And so there's states like North Carolina, which I would say is sort of one of the top tier states as far as their planning and monitoring for flood early warning. And then there's other states that have nothing. The whole state has no organized plan for dealing with monitoring for flooding or anything else. And I guess what I'd like to say is that the people in North Carolina have really taken full responsibility. In other places, I wish it was going on everywhere else, because if every state in the country had a flood warning system as well structured and planned as North Carolina's, then the whole country would have a lot less risk related to flooding, because they'd have more early warning, and people could do things to either get themselves or protect their businesses or assets out of harm's way, because that additional information, because flooding causes damage to people and economic damage to areas, and the more warning you have, the less damage and less risk you end up having to deal with.
Right. No, that's excellent insight. Thank you, James. We have an interesting question here. For help, can agencies reach out to other AEM customers for advice or recommendations? This particular user says, audience member says they'd be willing to share their information with other customers.
I could talk a little bit about that. So I think that what I've found is that almost every agency in the country that has a planned and well thought out early warning system, those people are really willing to help any other agency that's trying to do it. They give them advice. They tell them what's worked and what hasn't worked for them. They share their lessons learned. So I would say that reaching out to other agencies is a really valuable concept. I'd also say that I know that we've helped a lot of people by connecting people. Like one agency that's trying to do something, we connect them with another agency that's already done that thing. And and I'll just give you a couple of examples. The federal government has these grant programs where they are helping to fund the portion of the flood early warning systems for different areas. And those grant programs, the agencies that have been successfully getting the grants are sharing their grant applications with the other agencies that want to apply for the grants, so that they can essentially reuse the information that because these forms sometimes could be daunting to try to put together a grant application and get all the right information there. But if you see how somebody else successfully did it, it's a lot easier for you to look at all their answers and say, okay, well, they wrote this, but for me, it's this. And you can basically get the applications done better that way. So that's also another thing besides asking advice from these agencies. I'd also, reach out. We can help put you in touch with previous grant applications that were successful, so you can use those to help fund what you're trying to do, because that's a big part of it, is funding the system. Because that's sort of a key thing before you should even take on a flood early warning system, is how are you going to fund it, and how you're going to keep it ongoing basis in the future.
Actually, James, right, that raises a really good question. One of the challenges I often hear about, and I think you guys often hear about too, is funding, right? Funding is a constant issue with lots of communities. So I would imagine a lot of cases you got what your ideal funding level would be and what your ideal network would be. And a lot of times maybe you're doing something maybe a little less than that because it's not quite within the budget. So how do you decide, what's absolutely essential for a system versus what compared to your ideal, and where you should be landing on that spectrum?
Yeah, so kind of what we talked about in the presentation, obviously at the beginning of this, you want to consider every possible, you want to add everything you could potentially think of in terms of locations, right? And what you want to monitor. And then you put your own specific grading criteria upon those, like the accessibility and requirements for seeing the base station, that type of thing. And you start to go through, you start whittling down. What you don't want to do is end up in a situation where you're putting stations where you can afford them and not where you need them. And so, some early investigative work before even writing that grant and figuring that out to see how much money you could have would allow you to provide a better estimate in your grant process as to how much money you think you need for the sites and locations. And so, our guys have helped lots of people with preliminary quotes to get their grant going. It's a typical step when trying to write a grant. And so, you definitely don't want to end up with less grant money than you were prepared for, and then you're stuck with, well, we got to take out stations we think we need. That's my recommendation, doing that investigative work as early as you possibly can.
That's great advice. That makes a lot of sense. James, do you want to add to that in any way, or?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've done, that I've helped some agencies with, is I've sort of built some, I'll just call them budgetary spreadsheets. You sort of build it, and it helps you sort of look at how much something's going to cost, and it gives you big picture numbers that help you say, okay, if I'm really going to do this and I'm thinking that it needs to be this big, how much is that going to cost me? Because knowing, getting budgetary estimates sort of lets you figure out, okay, now I know what I need to plan for. Is this going to be a small or a medium or a large project for my agency that I'm working with, and getting those sort of high level numbers really help. And all the numbers that we have a lot of historical information with other agencies where we can say, okay, well, this agency did this. They had, they implemented 25 stations and software and all this, and this is what it costs them to do that. How would that apply in your situation? And we have sizes from small to medium to really large that all have those type of sizing estimates. And we use that to help us with our planning and helping our customers plan things, because that knowing how big the size of the budget you need is a big part to planning a system.
Thank you, James. And I want to be respectful of your time, also our audience's time. So I think that's about all the time we have for questions today. If you did find today's presentation helpful, I would encourage you to check out the other webinars in the series. Those include our introduction to the principles that should guide you when developing a flood warning system. James referenced that earlier. Also, our more recent webinar on risk knowledge, that first pillar of flood early warning systems. We'll have links to each of those in the email that comes your way later. I'd also encourage you to be on the lookout for the next webinar in our series. James also mentioned that. It's going to be on forecasting flood risk. We'll be sure to let you know as soon as that gets scheduled. In addition to our other webinars, I do highly recommend checking out our new interactive vision for flood readiness. It includes videos from industry experts, including James is featured in there. It shows examples of community resilience in action, so you can get a sense of what people are doing it right, what they're already doing. It even includes a self-assessment, so you get a good baseline of where you currently stand versus where you might want to be. The link to that resource is shown on your screen here. It's also going to be included in your follow-up email. And with that, it is now time to bring our webinar to a close. So again, I want to thank James, Ryan, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedules. You shared some fantastic information with us today, so thank you. And also thank you to all of you in the audience. I mean, without you, there is no webinar to be had. So thank you for attending today. And with that, as a reminder, we will be sending out a link to the recording and slide deck for everyone who registered for today's webinar. And if you have any remaining questions about the webinar or about AEM, please feel free to email them to us at info@aem.eco. So thanks again. Have a great day.